Good evening, everyone, from a balmy Brentford, and that's a balmy with an L, in case you're wondering. Uh, Thanks for joining us. When I'm sure many of you would rather be in the garden, and you never know, perhaps you are. Hopefully, you are. My name's Paul Dryborough. I currently chair the British Association for Local History, and it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's webinar, and then to come back and chair the Q&A session later. So, as hopefully many of you know, this is the fourth and final lecture in our collaboration with the Historic Towns Trust. And it's been a great series so far, and I hope many of you have joined us to find out more about the latest research into Britain's historic towns. So I'm going to hand over very shortly to tonight's actual chair, Professor Keith Lilly of Queen's University Belfast. But before I do, just the standard housekeeping. So tonight's webinar is being broadcast on Zoom webinar, so you're not therefore going to be able to see each other or come on screen. And that's perfectly normal. You can turn on live captioning should you wish by pressing the CC button, which is on the bottom bar of, at least on my screen. So I'll be taking questions, as I say, at the end. So feel free to pose those as we go along using the Q&A function in your Zoom toolbar. For general conversation, telling us where you are this evening, or to raise any technical issues with our technical team during the webinar, please use the chat box, not the Q&A box. So Keith, I'm now going to hand over to you to lead on tonight's proceedings. Welcome.
Thanks very much, and good evening, everybody, from a maybe not so balmy Northern Ireland, where I am. I'm a Professor of Historical Geography at Queen's University Belfast, but another hat I used to wear was as chair of the Historic Towns Trust, and it was a great collaboration to be working with the British Association of Local History in these lecture series. They've been going now for a few years, and tonight's talk is going to be about one of the new publications arising from a collaboration with the University of Chester with the Historic Towns Trust for a new historical map of Chester, which I'm sure many of you will be well aware is a really important historic city in these islands with a very rich past. And we're going to be hearing a little of that past tonight from our two speakers, but we have one person presenting, but two co-authors, if you like. So I'm going to introduce Tom and Catherine, if Tom is on camera. Let me say something about, hello, Tom, good to see you. So Dr. Tom Pickles is Associate Professor of Early Medieval History in the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Chester. He is General Editor for the Brepol series Studies in the Early Middle Ages, and a member of the advisory board of the journal Northern History, and chair of the Chester Archaeological Society. He's also a principal investigator of an AHRC research project called Early Christian Churches and Landscapes. And his latest monograph is Kingship, Society and the Church in Anglo-Saxon Yorkshire, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2018. And Tom is really the creator of, along with others as well, we've just been talking about that, the creator of the Historic Towns Trust Town and City Historical Map of Chester, which is the subject of tonight's talk, The City of Flows, Chester 400 to 1500. But before Tom maybe launches off, maybe I could also say a few words about the co-presenter or co-author, if you like. That's Catherine Wilson. Catherine is Professor of Later Medieval European History, also at the University of Chester, a double act. As a historian of the European later Middle Ages, Catherine's research and teaching focuses on the shifting patterns of material culture and its commercial, cultural and political contexts. She leads on Chester Festival of Ideas, and she is also the author or co-author of a Liverpool University Press book called Mobility of Objects Across Boundaries, 1000 to 1700, which was published in 2022. But tonight's talk is going to be delivered by Tom, and great to hear all about Chester this evening. And over to you, Tom. A City of Flows, Chester 400 to 1500.
Thanks very much, Paul and Keith, and thanks to the HTT and BALH for the invitation to do this. It's a great pleasure. Hopefully you can see my screen share of what is the cover of the imminent historical map of Chester. And we want to talk tonight about Chester as a city of flows in the Middle Ages. As Keith has already suggested, we have interests spanning, in British terms, the Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Norman, and medieval periods. And together we're interested from different directions in urbanization, in the development of markets, in thinking about commerce and consumers, and in thinking about some broader trends like the impacts of the Viking diaspora on those developments, the evolution of an English kingdom, the Norman conquest and its impacts, and the commercial and consumer revolutions of the later Middle Ages. And we're going to deal with all of these in some way in relation to Chester tonight. Well, we were delighted to be approached to think about doing an HTT historical map. For both of us, this was an opportunity to learn from those who already knew about it, really, about the historical geography of Chester in relation to these trends. We have been very reliant on a lot of material, as you will see tonight, from other people. There is already a fantastic Victoria County history of Chester recently produced by Alan Thacker and Chris Lewis as the general editors. There was also a wonderful series of books by David Mason on Roman Chester and Anglo-Saxon Chester, by Jane Lawton on life in medieval Chester, by Peter Carrington and Simon Ward on the whole of the history of Chester. And in addition to that, we had Keith Lilly and Catherine Clark's wonderful projects mapping medieval Chester and Discover Medieval Chester to work with. So really tonight, I feel like all I'm doing is pulling together a lot of material, as I was for the map, that other people had already identified. For those of you who aren't familiar with Chester, I should start with a brief introduction to it. So Chester is here nestled in a loop of the River Dee. Its main medieval defences you can see marked out around the edges here. It has four main roads: Northgate Street, Eastgate Street leading onto Foregate Street, Bridge Street leading down to the Old Dee Bridge, and Watergate Street leading, unsurprisingly, to the Watergate. It had ports in the Middle Ages down here by the Dee Bridge with the Shipgate, and probably somewhere on this side of the city, perhaps close up to this, the Watergate, which we will meet later. It also had this fantastic weir, which you can still see today, with mills at either end. It had a wonderful Anglo-Norman and medieval castle, markets at the cross outside St. Peter's Church and outside the gates of what was then St. Werburgh's Abbey, now the cathedral. It had some of its urban administrative buildings like the Common Hall here and the Pentis, fantastic court building, which we'll meet again, constructed around the outside of St. Peter's at the cross, the church. The main streets were flanked, as they still are, by the unique medieval rows. There were religious communities at St. Werburgh's, at St. John's, a nunnery by the castle, and three friaries, which we'll come back to, occupying parts, western parts of the city. There were hospitals at the North Gate, dedicated to St. John, and out at the eastern limits of the city, dedicated to St. Giles. And there were areas which were much more green common land in the Middle Ages, the crofts stretching down the western side of the city, and the Rue Dee, where the Chester races now take place. So this is the medieval Chester that we're thinking about. And what we want to consider is two approaches to thinking about its evolution across this period. One is the local global, and the other is the idea of the city of flows, which is in the title. Let's start with the local global, or local universal, if you like. From a very well cited collection of essays edited by A.G. Hopkins that you can see here on global history, to recent special issues of Past and Present, the journal, which you can also see here. There have been arguments for writing histories of what is described as the local global or the local universal. This idea observes that local societies lie behind our global or universal trends. It explores how those societies generate those global or universal trends, but also how they're transformed by them. It recognizes that those local societies supplied the labor by which things were discovered and manufactured, that they forged the demand for things as well as the thoughts and behaviors that transformed those things into objects, and that they created the networks of people, things, and ideas through which the dialogue between local and global or universal trends occurred. So this is one starting point for thinking about Chester. How did it evolve? How did that local society develop and tap into those global or universal trends? The second approach is the city of flows, as we describe it here. Now, Keith is much more familiar with this. He introduced us to this idea, and this belongs to the work of Manuel Castells. To understand urban settlements in the modern information age, Manuel Castells suggested that we should focus on the interaction between what he called the spaces of places and the space of flows. By the space of places, he meant the locality or physical neighbourhoods within which work, private life, cultural identity, and political participation play out. By the space of flows, he meant the global economic, technological, informational, and institutional networks that exist and that connect to these space of places. From this perspective, the competing logic of the space of places, the locality, and the space of flows, the links between geographically distinct locations, structures urban settlements. The result is the shifting prioritization of parts of urban settlements and the subordination to them of urban functions and forms. Well, these are two very grand ways of saying we'd like to think about some big shifts that were occurring across the Middle Ages and think about what Chester maybe contributed to them, also perhaps how it was transformed by them. But above all, what we don't know and what we would really like to know. We're going to do this by thinking about briefly the post-Roman period, but then more substantially the Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo-Norman, and the medieval periods in relation to Chester. But before we do that, we need to think about a little bit of immediate context for the development of the city. We need to start with topography and geography, thinking about Chester as a strategic corridor, and by thinking about Roman Chester as a strategic capital, because it is from Roman Chester that medieval Chester emerged. Let's think about topography and geography. Think of Britain, as you probably already do, of two broad zones, our lowland south and east, and our upland north and west. The Cheshire Plain links these zones. It's a lowland corridor to the Irish Sea, to northwest England and to northern Wales, flanked by the uplands, the English Pennines and the Welsh Clwydians, which by chance is where I am now, that's where I live. This corridor, this lowland corridor, the Cheshire Plain, is divided north-south by ridges of sandstone and by rivers which drain out into the Irish Sea, the Dee, on which Chester sits, the Gowie and the Weaver. Chester straddles a sandstone outcrop terminating in the Wirral Peninsula. It nestles in that loop of the River Dee, which reaches the sea west of Wirral. And this puts it at a really important point in this strategic corridor. Why is that? Well, the answer may be that Roman Chester was intended to be a strategic capital during the Roman conquest of Britain. So Chester originated in the 70s AD as a Roman legionary fortress, which you can see here on Giles Dark's wonderful overview map, laying it out over the plan of the modern city. This was called Deva, named from the River Dee. Its position reflects strategic concerns. From the 70s AD, the Romans were conquering middle and western Britain and redeploying garrisons from the southern and eastern lowlands to Caerleon, to Chester and to York. As David Mason put it in writing about Chester, located at an equal distance from these other two fortresses and with a direct line of communication back to the southeast and the Channel ports, as well as facing out onto the Oceanus Lavernicus, the Irish Sea, Chester was in many ways now the nodal point of the frontier zone of Britain. Fortress was sited to unite overland with riverine and seaborne communication at the lowest bridgeable point on the Dee, where the river flows westwards through a restricted gorge and then loops northwards, forming a natural harbour. It sits on a hogback of land, providing a view of the bridge and access to the harbour. Begun about 74 AD, the fortress may have been intended as a headquarters, therefore, for the provincial governor. It was about 20% larger than comparable fortresses. It had a monumental curtain wall. It included an enigmatic elliptical building, which you can see roughly centre here. This was perhaps a monument commemorating Rome and its emperors. It incorporated other unusual buildings, possibly administrative spaces, accommodation and storage for the governor and his entourage. And imperial inscriptions unusually appeared on its lead water pipes. Although the more usual buildings were completed, the construction of these special features ceased around AD 79, perhaps due to changing political circumstance. But the fortress endured and was probably abandoned in the 390s. Beyond the fortress defences were a port, civilian baths, a hostel, an amphitheatre, which when fully developed was the largest in Britain, a parade ground, and shrine to the goddess Minerva, south of the River Dee. So you can't see that on this plan. So it was from this Roman location that the medieval city of Chester developed. And I think we can see it retaining these features as a strategic place and a symbolically important place in terms of thinking about the relationship between Britain and the Irish Sea. But the fortress itself was abandoned and disappeared. And what happened afterwards is fairly obscure to us at the moment. What were the big shifts that were taking place in the post-Roman period? Well, following Chris Wickham's monumental study on the left here, framing the early Middle Ages, we can think about this as a shift from a tax state with tax in coin that can employ standing army and paid bureaucrats to keep track of the tax, and can therefore use that tax income in part for the kind of infrastructure that we're seeing in the fortress. A shift from that through to what he describes as land states. These are petty kingdoms in which the power of individuals depends on the rent or tribute from their own land and their ability to command other landed warriors by acquiring more land and more movable wealth, more treasure, often through expansion and through annual raiding. This shift takes place over a long period, and it takes place differently in different areas. And I think Robin Fleming's wonderful The Material Fall of Roman Britain puts back some of the local agency into this picture, thinking about the way people adapted to this shift from tax states to land states in different ways in different places, and how the material culture bears that out. The result was a patchwork of non-Christian kingdoms, at least in English-speaking southern Britain, with itinerant kings, but who viewed our monumental Roman remains as symbolically important for their own authority and power, and who, when they converted to Christianity, often employed those places for the foundation of religious communities. And John Blair's The Church in Anglo-Saxon England gives you that bigger picture on this. This might inform some of our understanding of what's going on in Chester in the post-Roman period. After abandonment, the legionary fortress remained a landmark and was perhaps a focus for settlement between the 600s and 800s. Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, completed about 731, relates that in about 616, Ethelfrith, who was king of the Northumbrians, mustered his army at or brought it to Chester, and that a battle took place nearby, probably to be located about a mile away at Heronbridge, where the excavations have uncovered what looks to be the 7th century battle cemetery. What was Ethelfrith doing at Chester? Was it merely a well-known, visible ruin, a location at which people could meet, or was there more to it? Excavations in the amphitheatre showed that the entrance and exit passages, the vomitoria, were blocked, perhaps in the post-Roman period, possibly to create a fortification, and uncovered some post-Roman occupation. We await the wonderful second volume of the amphitheatre excavations for all the details on this, but I understand potentially interpreted as an 8th or 9th century timber hall. So is this the sort of place that kings were holding assemblies at, or itinerating around and using as occasional fortifications in the post-Roman period? Beyond this, we have to rely on very questionable late medieval traditions. These suggest that 7th century kings of the Mercians founded a church of St. Peter. Do they mean a church under the present cathedral, rededicated to St. Werburgh, or the Church of St. Peter on the Cross, for instance, within the walls, and another church at St. John without the walls, which you can see here is next to the amphitheatre. And Alan Thacker observed possible plausible parallels for the idea of 7th century intra and extramural religious communities at other sites. So perhaps Chester was partially reoccupied also as a site for religious communities. But again, the question would be, does it become anything more than a religious community at that point? What do these communities potentially do in terms of generating markets, in terms of potentially generating any kind of urban development? Our first evidence then for Chester as a substantial urban centre comes from the 10th century. Here we're thinking about two phenomena, intertwined phenomena: the formation of an English kingdom and the impacts of the Viking diaspora on Britain. For the formation of an English kingdom, you can read George Molyneux's wonderful 2015 reassessment. We see our kings of the southwest, the West Saxons, expanding their authority outwards into areas which had been subjected to conquest and settlement by the great Viking army in the 9th century. Through a series of submissions and the building of what are described as burhs, fortified towns, they create a new kingdom of the English, eventually by the late 10th and early 11th century, sometimes referred to as England. We have a document from the early 10th century that describes for us a network of these burhs known as the Burgle Hidage, and gives us a formula for calculating the number of hides or land units attached to those burhs, the numbers of men that they would supply, and the lengths of the walls that would thereby be constructed and maintained. And that's what's mapped for you on this map, one of many mapping out the sites that are mentioned in the Burgle Hidage. Those kings also threw an administrative net over this new kingdom. They did so particularly from the reign of Edgar onwards, creating our network of hundreds and wapentakes, our local assemblies, and the network of regional assemblies known as shires, what become the counties that survived down to 1974. They also created a system of lordship, which deployed earls, bishops, and shire reeves, who were dependent on men who were commended to them, who held land from them, and who were under their legal jurisdiction, making kings pretty important authority figures, making those lords very dependent on the kings because their land holdings were scattered across the kingdom and they needed to defend the interests of the men under their lordship. And this is the story that Stephen Baxter's excellent The Earls of Mercia tells for us in unpicking that system of lordship and administration. At the same time, some of these burhs were becoming connected into what we call the Viking diaspora. And for this, go and have a look at, if you haven't already, at Peter Frankopan's The Silk Roads and Kat Jarman's River Kings, for thinking about the Vikings and their operation between East and West, seeking Eastern silver, often in return for Western slaves, and identifying the Irish Sea Zone as a particular area of slaving. Within the Irish Sea Zone, you can follow Claire Downham and David Griffiths looking for the sons and grandsons of Ivar, who sought to rule the Irish Sea Zone, and often connected together York and Dublin on an axis, political axis, and also as a trade route, uniting the Irish Sea with the North Sea across Middle Britain. Some little glimpses of the connections between our region and the East are found by recent Portable Antiquities Scheme finds. You can see these on the right, of Islamic coins, silver coins found on the Wirral from the late 6th and 8th centuries. So this is an area that's very heavily connected in. How does all this play out in Anglo-Saxon Chester? Well, during the 10th century, the defences in Chester were probably rebuilt and extended. Entries in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles state that in 893, a large army of Danes from amongst the East Angles travelled to a deserted fort in Wirral, which is called Chester, where Anglo-Saxon forces laid siege to them. Presumably, the fortress remains were then defensible. A Viking contingent was expelled from Dublin in 902, and a later tradition, in what's known as the Fragmentary Annals of Ireland, claimed that one of its leaders, Ingimund, travelled to Ethelfled, ruler of the Mercians, who settled him on land near Chester, after which he grew envious of the wealth of the city, attacked it, but was defeated. And certainly the beach market at Mells on the tip of the Wirral, written up amongst others by David Griffiths, and the network of place names, which has been reviewed by Stephen Harding most recently, Old Norse place names on the Wirral suggest that there was indeed Viking activity on the Wirral and a settlement of Old Norse speakers to the north of Chester. A further final entry in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for 907 states, in this year Chester was restored, which is likely to signal the rebuilding and extensions of its walls. Based on the Burgle-Heidige's formula for the relationship between the walls and the hides and the people, we can take Domesday Book, which tells us that Chester's walls and bridge were maintained by one man from every hide in the Shire, and we can try to find walls of the right length. And using that information and excavations, it's been suggested that the northern and eastern defences of the Roman fortress, so up here, northern ones down to the river, and the eastern ones down to the river, were extended, thus giving a circuit length in proportion to the number of hides in the Shire, perhaps in addition to the length of the bridge, that being the Old Dee Bridge, or the predecessor of the Old Dee Bridge as it is now. The medieval streets in Chester evolved from those of the Roman fortress and the Anglo-Saxon burh. The Roman east-west streets, the Via Principalis, became Eastgate and Watergate streets leading across the centre, but extended beyond the fortress. The Roman street joining these to the southgate, the Via Praetoria, became Bridge Street, so running south. And the Roman street running from the north gate, the Via Decumana, was extended down to what's now the Cross and St. Peter's Church. And this had been extended by the 11th century. The perimeter behind the fortress defences, the Via Segularis, may have influenced the routes of various streets, Whitefriars to the south, Weaver Street and Trinity Street to the west, and Water Tower Street to the north. And the outer patrol track might have shaped the development of Pepper Street and Coppin Street and Nicholas Street and Crofts Lane to the west. In fact, the Anglo-Saxon burh probably included many of the streets first documented in the medieval period. They probably reused the Roman inner perimeter and outer patrol tracks, with some parts then later abandoned. Insights from some excavations, comparisons with other burhs and topographical analysis suggest they created a rectilinear grid. Crook Street and Hamilton Street seem to be minor, Hamilton Place seem to be minor Roman streets recommissioned in the 900s. Newgate Street and Park Street were probably established when the Anglo-Saxons extended the defences down here in the south east corner. And the laying out of a regular grid might have included Goss Street and St Werburgh Street running north at even intervals, and Duke Street, St Olive Street and Castle Street running west-east from the main southbound street, parallel to the river. Domesday Book reveals the result of all of this: a well-developed city, the administrative centre of Cheshire, with urban properties connected to manors in the shire beyond. Under the lordship of the king, his bishop and his earl, it was a borough with burgesses, overseen by 12 lawmen drawn from the men of the king, bishop and earl. It possessed a mint with 7 moneyers and a port where ships traded goods, including marten pelts. It was protected by walls and served by its bridge. It included 2 religious communities, St Werburgh's, now the cathedral, and St John, with the adjacent minster of St Mary as it's described beyond the walls, the prominent church of St Peter at the Cross here, and some 487 houses, so a population of maybe 1,500 to 3,000, depending how you do your calculations. The question is, how much of what we see in the Middle Ages had already developed by this stage? There was probably a market at the Cross. There was certainly an extraordinary mint, for a time in the 10th century, the most prolific coin-producing mint in Britain. It seems likely that the burgages or messuages or tenements, the plots, the urban plots along the main streets, were laid out in the Anglo-Saxon period. There were probably also areas of common land, the crofts, and by the 12th century, the Rue D had ceased being covered by the Dee each tide and was becoming a permanent area of pasture. And outside, just to the northeast of the city, was an area known as Gorse Stacks. This was previously Hunwald's Mound, from an Old English personal name. And we know that these kind of mounds, real or imagined burial places, were often in the Anglo-Saxon period a gathering place for a range of activities. And this remained that kind of place all the way through Chester's medieval and early modern history. A reference to the watering place commons at Cow Lane End indicates it was common land reached by Cow Lane, Horn Lane, Bag Lane, and taking in Gorse Stacks, George Street, Brook Street, Bowling Green Bank, Frodsham Street and Milton Street. It was the horse market in the early modern period, and it subsequently became a cattle market, and it's where fuel was stacked for the city bakeries, hence Gorse Stacks. And at different points, place names suggest middens, a bowling green, a cockpit, a palisade enclosing an area for a tournament, a lists, Justin Croft, and a watering place for horses. And it seems likely that it was serving some of these functions, at least, in the Anglo-Saxon period. Perhaps all of this activity should be pushed back into the 10th century, and perhaps it should be associated with the Viking diaspora. Our Chester coins include the names of moneyers from various different linguistic backgrounds. Anglo-Saxon, yes, but also Irish, Frankish, and indeed Old Norse, like Thomodr here. So there were Old Norse speakers in Chester. We have a wonderful mixed bullion, coin and hack silver jewellery hoard, the Castle Esplanade hoard, which fits into the mixed bullion, coin and hack silver economy of the Viking diaspora, and sits with the hoards associated with raiding and trading across the Irish Sea Zone, around the Western Isles and Northern Isles of Scotland and into Scandinavia. We have a wonderful set of ringed pins from Chester, which, as I understand it, are a Hiberno-Norse type of dress fashioner, which are taken up by Scandinavians and spread across the diaspora as far as Russia. And we have this fantastic oval brooch, which has its twin from Dublin and seems likely to be from the same mould as that one from Dublin. And these tend to be worn distinctively with Scandinavian female types of dress. We have a wonderful collection of Hiberno-Norse wheel-headed crosses from St John's Church, and the Redcliffe Quarry by St John's Church was being used to create these and to supply them to churches across the Wirral Peninsula. It's been suggested, therefore, that there might have been a strand with Vikings operating on it beneath St John's Church, and that this was a sculpture workshop serving that community in Chester and others in the Old Norse-speaking communities up on Wirral. And we have St Olave's Church, dedicated in the early 11th century to the Old Norse Saint Olaf, royal saint. And we have areas of Hanbridge, south of the river, which were calculated in Domesday Book, not in ploughlands, but in carucates, the Scandinavian, the Old Norse version of these. Perhaps all of this helps us to understand the strategic and symbolic importance of this area. It's likely that this is the area that Athelstan travelled to for the famous Battle of Brunanburh in order to establish his dominance over Britain in 937. And in 973, we're told that Edgar, King of the English, met 6 or 8 kings at Chester. And by the 1100s, it was said that they'd rode Edgar on the Dee up to St John's Church. Well, for all of this Anglo-Saxon urban development, the city was transformed in the Anglo-Norman period, again by some major, what we might call universal or global trends in Britain. We can think about these in terms of conquered England. Following George Garnet, the Norman conquests justified the giving of the English kingdom as an estate from Edward the Confessor to William the Conqueror. This allowed William to redistribute the land of those who'd resisted him, or indeed make people buy back their land, and made all land dependent on the king. This created a tenurial revolution, the replacement of an Anglo-Saxon aristocracy with a Norman aristocracy, and what Stephen Baxter in the Social History of England has outlined as a feudal revolution. The shift, if you like, to an aristocratic economy. The concentration of a huge amount of land in a very small number of hyper-wealthy barons. In Chester, this is witnessed in William the Conqueror's harrying of the north, where he travels to York and to Chester as 2 strategically important places to assert his dominance, and establishes a castle and places Chester under the authority of new earls. Graham White, my former head of department at Chester, well, before I arrived, has written a fantastic paper in Rulership and Rebellion, following the way in which the Earls of Chester, in turn, created out of a huge area of land holdings in Cheshire, a jurisdictional immunity by creating administrative apparatus parallel to that of the royal household. And this meant Chester became a jurisdictional immunity within the kingdom, but largely outside royal administration. How did this affect the city? Well, obviously we had the construction of the castle in the harrying of the north, and we can see here Martin Moss's wonderful 3D reconstruction of the eventual inner and outer ward rebuilt in stone for his company Dextra Visual. You can see these on YouTube if you want to go and watch his fly-throughs reconstructions of these and other buildings that I'm going to bring up. This becomes an administrative centre for the earls and for what would have been the kingdom's administrative apparatus. So this is where the constable and justice of Chester live. It's also where the Shire Hall for Cheshire and the Exchequer, paralleling the Royal Exchequer, develops. And these are housed within the castle. And this includes the levelling and takeover of a huge area of the southwestern part of the city. We can also see the development of the defences, the port, perhaps the weir and the mills in this period. In the 1100s, the full 2-mile circuit of the city walls was completed, and we'll give you the information for that on the back, the reverse of the forthcoming map. The Chester monk Lucian, in his In Praise of Chester, the Laude Chestrii, written around 1200, commented that the Dee was a port for ships coming from Aquitaine, Spain, Ireland, and Germany, which bring industrious merchants to replenish the city. The city had jurisdiction from Herronbridge all the way upriver to Arnold's Eye and downriver to Hillborough by the tip of Wirral. And it had its principal quays here by the Shipgate, as you can see, and over on the other side by the Watergate and Water Tower. How long had Chester been a major port in that way? That's a question for us to ask. Is it the development of this aristocratic economy that creates the surpluses and the investment in the city that drives this international exchange through the city? A summer fair existed over 3 days in June. By the time Earl Hugh I granted its jurisdiction and tolls, rents and issues to St Werburgh's in about 1092. Again, how long had that existed before then? The second market was apparently created by Earl Ranulph II in the second quarter of the 12th century in front of the Abbey Gatehouse. The origin of the weir that we can see here, an associated causeway, is not known for certain. It's man-made, but it's usually attributed to Earl Hugh Lupus as a device to direct water for powering mills and dated to about 1093. The corn mills were immediately west of the Dee Bridge, weir and causeway on the north bank of the Dee, and the fulling mills were east of the Dee Bridge at the east end of the weir and causeway on the south bank. And from the late 1000s, many valuable fisheries become visible. So in the late 11th century in the River Dee, and continued in use down to the 1900s. And again, the question becomes, how old were these fisheries? Did they just appear in the record at this point? Or are they new? Are they a consequence of this Norman investment in the city? There's new investment, certainly. At St Werburgh's in 1092, Hugh Earl of Chester refounds it as a Benedictine monastery. At St John's, the Bishop of Lichfield moved the see to Chester with St John's as the Episcopal Church in 1075. Unfortunately, he moved it again to Coventry between 1087 and 1102, but nevertheless kept residences at the church. One of its canons was often the archdeacon, and it was used for ordinations, and it was heavily rebuilt in the 12th century and then again in the later Middle Ages. A new nunnery was founded by Earl Ranulph II of Chester, here just adjacent to the castle in the Crofts. And new hospitals, a leper hospital dedicated to St Giles in Bolton at the eastern extremities. You can see it here on the bottom right. And a hospital dedicated to St John just outside the North Gate here. And our full suite of parish churches emerges: Holy Trinity, St Bridget, St Martin, St Mary on the Hill, St Michael, and St Chad. But again, the question remains, are these new, or should we see them, as Sarah Rees-Jones has argued for York, as part of a long-term development from the late Anglo-Saxon period through to the 12th century? Well, our final period is the Middle Ages proper. And here we need to think about some really big pan-European developments, the commercial and eventually consumer revolutions. North Sea and Mediterranean exchange networks became more closely connected, both the range and volume of objects passing between them. There was regional economic specialisation: silver in Saxony, wool in England, Iceland and Castile, finished woolcloth in Flanders, northern Italy, furs around the Baltic. There was rapid urbanisation in northern Italy and Flanders and the Low Countries, some huge cities up to 100,000 people, and a network of medium and smaller towns, so that by the end of the period, about 10% of the population is urban. And we get new economic institutions, a new merchant class and status group, urban institutions and laws, trade fairs, monetization, the invention of credit, of commercial contracts, of insurance and accounting, and indeed a process of commodification, thinking of things as objects for sale. While there are various models for how this might have happened, we can take following Chris Wickham here kind of marks this on feudal revolution approach, where we think about the development of that aristocratic economy, more aristocrats and wealthier aristocrats with greater surpluses to invest and in greater competition with each other to do that, creating regional demand, which then takes off when those regional centres interconnect as international centres. Or we can think about a Malthusian population growth model. Huge population growth in the order of about 250%, then crisis, labour rising in value compared to land, monetisation, and then demand from that lower population with more money, and then that process of commodification. You can see that in modelling the Middle Ages. Or we can think about a Smithian or Ricardian free market economy. We just need the right conditions for merchants to operate, whether it's Venice operating in triangular trade in the Mediterranean, or whether it's states or cities or manors that encourage free market speculation. Or we can think about geographical systems, cities as nodes in networks, Bruges as a particularly important node for all sorts of different reasons, both in exchange, but in terms of credit, commerce, banking. The difficulty is discovering when all this took off precisely, what comes first, and what the ultimate causes and consequences are of all of these changes. And that's always clear when you come down to the level of the individual city, as in Chester. Urban administration in Chester suddenly comes into view in the late 1100s with a guild merchant, but it really takes off in the 1240s with a mayor and sheriffs for the citizens who came to head an urban assembly by the 1390s. This is at our moot or common hall of Common Hall Street. We see the establishment of craft guilds and some 170 trades by the later Middle Ages. This is great. But the question is, are these things becoming visible in the documentary sources again, or are they really new phenomena? Precisely when are they coming into being and what's causing them? Chester becomes a really important centre for merchants. It's a node in two interlinked routes via the Irish Sea to the Atlantic seaboard of France and Spain, and via London to the Low Countries and Germany. The Wirral is a point of transshipment to Chester for heavier cargoes like wine and millstones, which were transferred on smaller crafts capable of navigating the Dee to Chester or into carts for transport overland. The Port Pool, a new outport just outside the city walls, becomes a docking point for medium-sized vessels carrying fish, Welsh slates, woolen cloth, hardware and malt. And the new tower, or water tower, was the immediate destination for smaller vessels with averages of 40 to 50 ships per year. You can see that on the bottom right in Martin Moss's Dextravisual 3D reconstruction again. The ships are travelling between Chester, Ireland, Brittany, Gascony, Spain and Portugal. Irish ships from Dublin, Howth, Malahide, Rush and Drofta, carrying sea fish, salmon hides, cloth, yarn from Ireland, and returning with salt wine, high-quality woolens and textiles, and metal pots and pans. Ships from Brittany and Gascony are coming with Breton canvas, Gascony wine, alum for fixing dyes, dye stuffs, honey, linen cloth, pitch, tar, salt, vinegar, and woad. Ships from Spain, particularly from the 1480s, are bringing wine, iron and oil, some angora, silk, velvet, licorice and skins. And then from 1509, cork, dyestuffs, figs, raisin, litmus, pepper, herbs, oil, sugar, wax and sweet wines. To export goods to Ireland, to control or purchase imported items for redistribution, and to furnish the people of Chester with particular wares, Chester was a focus for traders travelling overland from elsewhere in the English kingdom. Fish were exchanged with men from Staffordshire for metal horse trappings, from Warwickshire for scythes, and from Worcestershire for fruit and wood ash. Cloth was brought from Lancashire and Cumbria and Yorkshire in return for furs. Two cities developed particularly close relationships with Chester. Coventry via the trade in cloth, wine and dyestuffs for horses, furs and fish, and London via the trade in cloth, mercery wares, sweet wine, dyestuffs, paper, figs and raisins. So Chester became a location with merchants from many places. At the end of the period, just beyond 1500, the evidence permits us to say that Chester freemen comprised only 40 to 45% of the traders. The rest were English, Welsh, Irish, and continental merchants. To manage all of this and to deal with the silting of the Dee, new outports were created. First that port pool, just outside the city limits in the 1200s, and then Shotwick from 1449, and at places like Burton, Deanhall, Neston, Gayton, Heswall, Redbank, Dorpool, and Point of Ayre, moving further and further down the Dee. The water tower was built, as you can see here, to protect the harbour to the south and probably to observe shipping and enforce tolls. Most characteristically, the rows were created. These adapted a familiar form of medieval urban building, a subterranean undercroft with hall and shop above, to the topography and historical circumstances of Chester. The earliest records combined with stylistic dating of some stone vaulted undercrofts or some of the galleries connecting the arches, and dendrochronology of the timber superstructures reveals that the rows originated in the period 1250 to 1350. The Roman fortress had sat on that hogback of land with bedrock close to the surface and a sloping profile. The Romans probably created terraces. The row buildings circumvented the need to quarry out the bedrock and suited an uneven ground level. The ground floor of the row's buildings was often at the level of the undercroft on the street side, but of the first floor to the rear. They may result from an experiment in one area of the city where they're first recorded, such as around St. Peter's Church or the area known as the Selds, which is in this area. They evolved within existing plots, burgages, messuages, those tenements. These perhaps originated in the Anglo-Saxon period. They were wide. They produced a single undercroft supporting several shops, and this made a continuous gallery in front of the shops at first floor level desirable. One of the areas was known as the Selds, between the Common Hall, Bridge Street and Watergate Street, and these were private bazaars or covered market halls, also set over undercrofts and fronted by shops with galleries. Early rows had galleries with walkways extending to the streets, but by the later 1200s, timber porches were being added to the undercrofts, and their roofs provided structures sloping upwards from the walkway to the street side for display of goods. These were reconstructed in stone and brick and became known as the stallboards, and that's what you can see on this wonderful Louise Rayner watercolour here. And parts of them became associated with specific medieval trades. The west side of Northgate Street with Ironmonger's Row, the north side of Eastgate Street with Butter Shops, Baker's Row and Glover's Row, and the south side with Cornmarket Row. The east side of Bridge Street had the Mercer's Row, and the west side the Corvisiers or Shoemaker's Row and Saddler's Row. And the north side of Watergate Street was our Fleshers or Fleshmongers Row. Well, this expanded population was supplied with new friaries, as you can see on the left here, the Black Friars, the White Friars, and the Grey Friars in the course of the first and second half of the 13th century. And our merchants sometimes invested in new charitable organisations. So we'll end with some mercantile links between Cologne, London, and Chester, which seem to have resulted in interest in the linked cults of the Magi and St. Ursula, as J.H. Bennett spotted in a fantastic publication in the Chester Archaeological Society Journal. The Guild of St. Ursula, and you can see the Hospital of St. Ursula in a sketch on your right, was founded in 1510 to 11. And it was founded by Roger Smith, a brother of Sir Thomas Smith, probably a citizen and wool merchant, admitted as a freeman in the late 1400s, and made sheriff in 1499. He belonged to a wider family of merchants, the Smith of Coerdley in Lancashire, and Smith, Bishop of Lincoln and founder of Brasenose College, Oxford, and left sums to Thomas Smith of Chester, merchant. He stipulated that a house on Common Hall Lane should be made up with chimneys and draughts, and the said houses were to be kept by the mayor of the city and his brethren to the use of men who've held office and fallen into decay and necessity. And his executors created a chantry or hospital of St. Ursula with a fraternity or guild, 6 almshouses, all under the oversight of the fellowship or company of the mercery on a void of land for use of men or their wives. Bennett suggested, I think plausibly, that the inspiration for all this was the Hospital of St. Ursula in Bruges, supplied with Hans Memling's fantastic shrine to Ursula, and Thomas's mercery dealings with the Low Countries merchants. And I see this as a nice way to end in thinking about Chester as a city of flows. Our merchant with his merchant links founding a hospital dedicated to Ursula. And at that point, I will stop sharing and shut up.
Thanks ever so much, Tom. I'm just going to try and put my camera on. Oh, there we go. Brilliant. I mean, what a really rich story you've been able to set out for us there, using the map as a way of really engaging with that very detailed and kind of complicated historical depth to Chester. So you really breathe life into that for us. And I love the way you've been connecting the micro scale, the city itself, the individual places or spaces of places that you talked about to begin with those wider networks at the macro scale as well, and the bigger historical currents, and tapping into a really broad literature, ranging from the Roman period right through to the later medieval period. So well done. That was brilliant, magisterial. I think I have the privilege of asking you a question as the chair for the session this evening. And I mean, Chester, the way you described it and analysed it, it seems to encapsulate a sort of, well, I was going to say British urban history, but I probably mean English urban history, really, to be more specific. The various layers that we can begin to see and read through the map and through the landscape of the city itself. And you can see the way in which the map that you've been creating with colleagues begins to help us to really visualize those many layers and that really kind of complicated narrative. I suppose my question really is, Chester is one example of the Historic Towns Trust has produced other similar kinds of maps, including Canterbury, other English cathedral cities with Roman origins, actually, Canterbury, Winchester, York, you mentioned York a couple of times, as well as Chester now from your own work. And I just wonder whether you might sort of say, you know, Chester fits the mold, and it's kind of, when we compare these places and we put the map side by side, or whether there's something you think you can put your finger on and say, well, actually, no, Chester is really a bit different to those other places, a bit more distinctive. What do you think to that?
That's a huge question and hostage to fortune. Yeah. Thank you very much. No, it's a really good question. It is one that that obviously exercises my mind quite a lot. I'm struck really, I think, by the common problems that we identify when we start mapping these places out and trying to think about their origins. So the first thing I would say is I think a lot of them are comparable in terms of not necessarily their origins or the chronology, but the chronology of when things come into view for us, and the difficulties as urban spaces in identifying archaeologically when the takeoff might be as well. So the one that it makes me think of, simply because I reviewed his volume of it, was Martin Carver's fantastic volume on Stafford, actually, as an Anglo-Saxon burh. And he was playing down very reasonably the contribution of religious communities to the development of these sites. So one way of looking at them is they're reoccupied by religious communities in the 7th century. You know, you could think of Oxford, you could think of York, you could think of Chester, you think of Stafford itself, and that those communities are consumers who are not producers. They generate markets around the monastic site, and gradually we get a kind of urban growth, and that what the burhs are doing is fortifying those centres that are already beginning to grow as urban sites. And Martin, through his archaeology there, was able to suggest, no, the way in which he saw it was the garrisoning of the burh that had really kicked off production. And he was thinking about pottery production in particular there, I think, and the way that created demand in the city. And I think this is a big chicken and egg question for us in Chester. Do we take the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle references to an abandoned fortress at face value? Do we take those later medieval traditions about the early origins of the religious communities seriously or not? And to what extent was anything there in the 9th century that could be described as urban before that takeoff? So from an Anglo-Saxon point of view, that's where I'd begin. And I think you can ask the same question in somewhere like Oxford that I was familiar with when I was there, where there's lots of archaeological work been done, but it's still quite difficult to precisely date that kind of takeoff point. Yeah,
So
if that
thanks.
makes
I
sense.
mean, so Oxford is another example of one of the,
Yeah.
in fact, there's an atlas and not just an historical map from the Historic Towns Trust for Oxford, but also an atlas as well. And I mean, as well as York and Winchester, which we've mentioned. And maybe in due course, Chester, let's hope there may be the possibility of an historic.
Yeah, no, it would be very good. And I should say as well, you remind me that Canterbury is an interesting case where we do have much earlier documentary evidence, and it does look like that's a place that's taking off earlier than we can show in those other centres. But that may simply be the nature of the material that we've got surviving for us. So I think that would be one which looks different at the moment.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
thanks. And the map for Chester is going to be made available. It's going to be launched, I think, fairly soon.
11th of June, yeah, on the Chester University Exton Park campus up the Parkgate Road, and we will send out invitations. It will be an open event for people. We'll send out direct invitations to people, but also if others want to come, more than welcome.
Well, thanks again, Tom. That's my question as far as I know.
Brilliant.
So, Paul, I'm going to hand over to Paul now for the other range of questions, and just to say thank you ever so much, Tom, for that really great talk.
Brilliant. Well, thanks both, frankly. Tom, you may well have noticed there are things popping up in the chat saying how great talk everybody
I've
enjoyed
just
it.
opened it up, yeah.
So do share those with Catherine as well. And anybody who's got a question, please do send one in. At the moment, I've not actually got any questions. However, I've got one. That's all right. You talked a lot about growth and development, but we didn't hear much about decline. I was thinking about the Black Death, the waves of plague from the mid-14th century. How that obviously that affects trade, but how does it affect like the built environment? Does it stunt any further growth, or does it lead to development, other kinds of building or other kinds of urban development that in Chester that might not be the same as elsewhere? Or
That's a really good question. My answer to that is complete ignorance at the moment. Yeah.
fine.
No, and I think there is, from memory, there is some discussion of that in Jane Lawton's life in later medieval Chester, which is great. But I think in terms of, I think this is one of the greatest strengths and then challenges of producing these maps, where you get these slices. So it feels like you see things, certain periods contemporaneously on the ground. You then start writing the text up and you think, okay, there's certain periods of real growth in building works, for example. So it looks like in the churches you're dealing with particularly the 12th and into the 13th centuries as a period. But then in the rows, we're talking probably 1250 to 1350 is a really big period of investment in the city. We can talk more about investment, I think, so upswings than downswings.
Yeah.
So the one that's usually invoked is Edward's Wars of Conquests in North Wales, where Chester is used as the capital, and there's good documentary evidence for the bringing of men and supplies and craftspeople in through Chester. And often the rows were hung on that moment. And in fact, that doesn't look right now. But that was one of the suggestions. Maybe there was a sudden planning and laying out of those. But there certainly was a great deal of money around in the city at that point, I think. So I think we can see those high points more easily than we can see the decline. And that's probably what we see is periods where we're not seeing building work. But from an archaeological point of view at the moment, I don't think we've got the material to see decline in that period. Interestingly, we had Ben Jervis came to talk to us about his small towns project, and frustratingly in Cheshire, it yielded nothing. His trawl of material, because that might have helped us a little bit, I think, in looking at the small towns as opposed to Chester itself.
And there's no known like plague cemeteries in Chester from the medieval period.
I'm not going to chance my arm on that one.
Oh, no, fine.
I'd need to go and ask Catherine. Yeah,
no, sure.
I should know the answer to that.
That's fine. Nigel Tringham, who's another local celebrity and one of our own committee members, he mentioned, he says that, well, presumably there are entries for Chester on the England's immigrants database. So they're not.
Sadly not. So the great strength of the Chester records is that, I mean, you will know this, Paul, because the Earls are successful in creating these parallel set of institutions,
Yeah.
actually a lot of the records, some of which are in TNA now,
Yeah.
but a lot of the records which would have been centralized and would be in TNA are in fact in the archives and local studies. And we've got really quite good late medieval records in the city, but it does mean we're missing from the tax records that we use to underpin the England's Immigrants Project. So Chester is one of the frustrating cities where we should be able to see this, and at the moment we can't. It's a kind of blank spot. Bart Lambert, we have asked him about this, who worked on the project, and he suggested that he would expect it to look like a lot of the other cities with their substantial populations of immigrants, but we just can't see it at that point.
Although presumably you must get a lot of Irish trade merchants coming in, but also transient communities of people coming in for work, but also maybe going back to Ireland either as traders or as.
Yes. Again, what I was summarising from the documentary material for the later Middle Ages, which is there in the VCH, people want to trawl through it, or Jane Lawton's book, that documentary material shows all of that activity happening. What's harder to pin down is the residency, I think, just from the nature of the records. So how long they're in Chester for, yeah.
Very good. We've actually now got a couple of really good new questions coming in. Just on the tax front, Helen says there are some non-parliamentary taxes, she thinks, and the MIs, but I mean, Helen obviously works on the project as well, so on the E179 database project, so
Fantastic. Okay.
she knows. But Caroline asks, so a lot gets mentioned for Chester in terms of trade with Ireland, it's just mentioned, and you mentioned Welsh slates. How much influence did the Welsh and Welsh trade have in Chester? Isn't the monastery of Bangor-on-Dee in the early 600s connected to the Kingdom of Powys?
Yes, so different things, different periods there, but yes, absolutely. So the Battle of Chester is connected with the monastery at Bangor-on-Dee. The location out at Heronbridge, connected with Eccleston. There's a whole kind of question mark there about whether that area is a small foundation based on Bangor at Dee or part of its land holdings or something, if that's why the battle takes place there, because it does involve monks from Bangor-on-Dee praying. This is part of Bede's story about it. Quite separately, yeah, in terms of the Welsh trade, so direct you towards the Discover Medieval Chester project, so the one that Keith and Catherine Clark did. There's some terrific material on there thinking about Chester as that Welsh and English city, and reflecting particularly through the literary sources on the amount of trade and the stereotypes that were being generated in later medieval Chester. So rather than do that myself, go and have a look at that website, Discover Medieval Chester. There's a terrific set of material up there on that. Yeah, it's a really good point.
Right. So Claire asks, so she's really interested in the establishment of the independent Norman Earls. How unique was Chester in terms of that sort of independent? I mean, obviously Palatinate status is not unique, but in terms of like Earls carving out that kind of special territory.
Yeah, I think what's unusual is, so simple answer, Claire, I'll bore Claire about this at length at some other point. So that Paul will know this, there are lots of jurisdictional immunities, so of different types, and the chronology of them varies, and it's not always easy to pin them down. So people get immunities from certain aspects of royal administration. I think from Graham White's analysis, what's unusual in the Cheshire immunity, and might maybe comparable with Durham, for instance, is the development of really independent apparatus. So it's things like the Exchequer, it's the accounting that's going on for Cheshire in Cheshire. That's what makes it look in part quite different. I think also the fact that the Earls, they have a pretty uninterrupted marcher lordship. So they control a huge block, coterminous block of land. There are other examples of these, like the Rapes of Sussex, some of the other marcher lordships in the west. But from other immunities, jurisdiction immunities I'm familiar with, you're not often the only landholder within the immunity. And I think that allows them to increase their control over that jurisdictional immunity. It then also passes from the Earls back into Crown hands, so it remains weirdly a royal jurisdictional immunity from royal administration.
And of course, this is where Richard II gets a lot of his military might and political force in the late 14th century, and in his disputes with the Earls and Barons, etc.
Yeah,
Chester becomes a much more important kind of affinity in a way that Lancastrian affinity did earlier. Peter, I don't know, this is but just maybe for everybody's benefit. There's a long article on the Battle of Chester in the Journal of Chester, the Chester Archaeological Society, Volume 86, 2016, available through the Archaeology Data Service. which I'm sure you're aware of, but maybe for everybody else's benefit.
Yeah, no, it's well worth a look. It's very
Yeah.
good.
And Helen's back. I'm sure we can put you in touch if needs be. She's thinking of lists of names of collectors, tax collectors in the PRO deputy keeper reports, but she'd have to look at her own
Terrific.
list. So
No, that'd be brilliant. Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
as I say, Helen is the expert on sort of taxation in that area. And I've actually got no more questions. I know you need to be away fairly soon, so
I need to go and pick up a 10-year-old from her swimming club.
So
Yeah.
I'm going to wrap up now. So thanks, Tom, for a brilliant talk. Thanks to Keith for sharing.
Thank you very
As I
much.
said in my introduction to the whole event, this was the last in our series of collaborative lectures with the Historic Towns Trust for this year. Obviously, we very much hope to be able to bring you another series next year, if we can. That would be our 5th year. It sounds like there's plenty of new towns being mapped, so there's plenty of scope. This is also, I should say, the final in our autumn spring BALH lecture series. And all that really remains then is our own annual general meeting, which will take place on Thursday evening, the 22nd of May at 7 p.m. Do please join us for that, members and non-members. We'll obviously got the business meeting first, but there will be a free lecture that evening for everyone by our own president, Professor Jackie Eales, on the local history of the English Civil Wars. And Jackie's obviously great, so do come on for that. In the meantime, thanks to Tom. Do send our thanks to Catherine as well. I'm sure you get the recording, so she can see how well it went. To Keith and also to our technical team. See you all soon, hopefully. Good night, everyone. Enjoy the sun.